The city never sleeps, but tonight it feels like a graveyard of the living. Neon lights reflect off wet pavement, illuminating faces that blur into anonymity. In boardrooms, coffee shops, and subway cars they sit, men who have mastered the art of disappearing while still breathing. They speak, but their words carry no weight. They reach out, but their touch leaves no impression. They exist in a liminal space between being and nothingness, trapped in what Carl Jung would recognize as the most devastating form of psychological death, complete and utter invisibility. What does it mean to be invisible? Not the fantastical invisibility of comic books, but the soul-crushing reality of being present yet unnoticed, speaking yet unheard, striving yet unacknowledged. This is not about physical absence. It's about the gradual erasure of one's essence, the slow dissolution of identity, until what remains is a ghost haunting his own life. Jung understood something that modern psychology often misses. Invisibility is not a symptom, it's a choice. An unconscious, devastating choice to retreat from the very aspects of oneself that demand recognition. He called this the shadow, and he believed that most men live their entire lives running from it, never realizing that in their flight, they surrender their right to be seen. Tonight, we descend into the brutal psychology of the invisible man. We examine Jung's ruthless diagnosis and his even more ruthless cure, because according to the master of the unconscious, the path to visibility requires a journey through darkness so complete, so terrifying, that most men choose invisibility instead. But for those brave enough to face what lurks in their own depths, Jung promises something revolutionary: the transformation from ghost to God, from forgotten to unforgettable. The question is not whether you feel invisible. The question is whether you dare to discover why. There was a time when invisibility was impossible. In ancient tribes, every man had a role that mattered: hunter, protector, storyteller, shaman. His presence was felt because his absence meant death for the community. Fast forward through history. The blacksmith whose hammer rang through the village, the soldier whose courage determined the fate of nations, the father whose word was law in his household. These men couldn't hide even if they wanted to. Their very existence was woven into the fabric of survival and meaning. But somewhere between the Industrial Revolution and the iPhone, something broke. The digital age promised connection, but delivered isolation. The modern economy promised fulfillment, but created interchangeable cogs. Men who once built cathedrals now push papers. Warriors became wage slaves. Leaders became followers of algorithms. Jung saw this coming decades before social media turned human connection into performance metrics. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he warned that when society strips individuals of their archetypal roles, they don't just lose their jobs, they lose their souls. The invisible man isn't invisible because he lacks talent or ambition. He's invisible because the very systems designed to give him purpose have been systematically dismantled. Consider the factory worker replaced by automation, spending his final days training the robot that will make him obsolete. Watch the young man scrolling endlessly through feeds, consuming other people's lives while his own withers from neglect. Observe the dating app phenomenon, where men send hundreds of messages into the void, receiving silence in return, each rejection teaching him that his thoughts, his feelings, his very existence can be dismissed with a swipe. This isn't just social change, it's psychological warfare. When a culture tells its men they're toxic for being aggressive, disposable for being traditional, and privilege blind for seeking purpose, it creates what Jung called psychological inflation in reverse. Men who shrink from their own power until they vanish entirely. The statistics tell the story: rising male suicide rates, plummeting testosterone levels, an epidemic of young men living in their parents' basements, lost in virtual worlds, because the real world has no place for them. But Jung would say the numbers miss the deeper truth. These men aren't failing, they're disappearing. And invisibility, once chosen, becomes a prison. The tragedy is that society benefits from invisible men. They don't make waves, don't demand raises, don't challenge authority. They consume products designed to numb their pain and vote for leaders who promise to make their problems disappear. The invisible man is the perfect citizen of a system that profits from his emptiness. But Jung's diagnosis goes deeper than sociology. He understood that external invisibility always reflects internal abdication. The culture may create the conditions, but the man chooses whether to surrender or fight. And fighting, according to Jung, requires embracing the very darkness that terrifies modern men most. Carl Jung's most revolutionary insight was also his most disturbing. The things we hate most about ourselves often contain the seeds of our greatest power. He called this rejected aspect of the psyche the shadow. And he believed that most human suffering comes from the exhausting effort to keep it hidden. For men, the shadow typically contains everything society has taught them to suppress: raw ambition, sexual hunger, competitive drive, protective aggression, and the primitive need to dominate their environment. These aren't character flaws. They're evolutionary advantages that ensured human survival for millennia. But in our sanitized world, they've become forbidden territory. The invisible man is almost always a man at war with his shadow. He's internalized the message that his instincts are dangerous, problematic, even evil. So he amputates them. He becomes the nice guy who never takes what he wants, the team player who never leads, the sensitive male who mistakes weakness for wisdom. He thinks he's becoming more evolved, but Jung would say he's becoming less human. This internal civil war manifests in devastating ways. The man who suppresses his aggression becomes passive-aggressive, leaking poison instead of wielding power. The man who denies his sexual nature becomes either a predator in secret or a monk by force. The man who rejects his competitive instincts becomes mediocre, then bitter about his mediocrity. Jung documented case after case of men who cracked under the pressure of shadow suppression. The businessman who spent decades being reasonable only to have a midlife breakdown involving prostitutes and sports cars. The devoted husband who never expressed anger until he exploded in violence. The spiritual seeker who preached love while harboring murderous fantasies. The shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It grows stronger in the darkness. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency for suppressed psychological content to return with multiplied force. The invisible man isn't peaceful. He's a volcano waiting to erupt. His very invisibility is an act of violence against his own nature. But here's where Jung's wisdom becomes brutal. The shadow isn't the enemy. It's the source of everything the invisible man claims to want. Respect comes from those willing to be disrespected. Love comes from those who aren't afraid to be hated. Success comes from those who embrace the risk of failure. Visibility comes from those brave enough to cast a shadow. The invisible man has convinced himself that he's invisible because he's not good enough, smart enough, or attractive enough. Jung would say he's invisible because he's not authentic enough. He's presenting a sanitized version of himself to the world, and the world responds to sanitization with boredom. People can sense when someone is hiding their true nature, and they instinctively look away. The paradox is maddening. The very qualities that make a man good, according to modern standards, are often the qualities that make him forgettable. Meanwhile, the men who integrate their shadows, who own their darkness while choosing how to express it, become magnetic. They don't have to fight for attention because their presence commands it naturally. Jung's shadow work isn't about becoming evil. It's about becoming whole. It's about reclaiming the discarded aspects of masculinity and wielding them consciously rather than unconsciously, because a man who owns his shadow casts a shadow that others can see. Carl Jung was not a therapist who offered comfort. He was a psychological surgeon who demanded that his patients endure the pain of their own transformation. His advice to invisible men would not be gentle encouragement. It would be a slap across the face, a demand to wake up from the coma of comfortable numbness. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, tells to become who you truly are, but becoming requires destroying who you pretend to be. For the invisible man, this means confronting a terrifying possibility, that his invisibility is not society's fault, not his parents' fault, not his genetics' fault. It's his choice. And if it's his choice, he can choose differently. The ruthless cure begins with brutal self-honesty. Jung called this holding the tension of the opposites, acknowledging both the saint and the sinner within, the hero and the coward, the lover and the destroyer. The invisible man must ask himself questions that cut like surgical instruments. What am I hiding from myself? What do I pretend not to want? What would I do if I weren't afraid? What am I afraid people would see if they really looked? This process, which Jung called individuation, is not therapy, it's resurrection. It requires the death of the false self, the carefully constructed persona that seeks approval above authenticity. The invisible man must be willing to disappoint people, to be misunderstood, to be rejected by those who prefer his ghost to his reality. Jung understood that integration of the shadow is not about unleashing chaos. It's about conscious choice. A man who owns his aggression can choose when to be fierce and when to be gentle. A man who acknowledges his sexuality can choose how to express it honorably. A man who embraces his competitive nature can choose worthy battles. But a man who denies these aspects has no choice at all. They control him from the shadows. The ruthless cure demands action, not just insight. Jung believed that psychological understanding without behavioral change was worse than ignorance, because it provided the illusion of progress without actual transformation. The invisible man must begin making different choices, speaking his truth even when it's uncomfortable, pursuing what he wants even when it's difficult, setting boundaries even when it causes conflict. This is where Jung's advice becomes truly ruthless. He would tell the invisible man to stop waiting for permission to exist. Stop seeking validation from a world that profits from his absence. Stop trying to earn his right to take up space. The path to visibility is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming unapologetic for being human. The cure requires embracing what Jung called the creative illness, like the necessary breakdown that precedes breakthrough. The invisible man must be willing to shatter his comfortable prison and rebuild himself from the fragments. This process is not just difficult, it's terrifying. It means risking everything familiar for something unknown, but Jung's promise is absolute. A man who integrates his shadow becomes unignorable, not because he's loud or aggressive, but because he's authentic. His presence carries weight because he's not hiding his substance. He speaks with authority because he's not betraying his own truth. He attracts respect because he respects himself enough to be real. The alternative, according to Jung, is a living death, existing as a shadow of potential, haunting the edges of life until the final fade to black. History remembers those who refuse to disappear. From Alexander the Great's conquest of the known world to Gandhi's quiet revolution, from Michelangelo's divine art to Einstein's cosmic insights, the men who carved their names into eternity shared one crucial characteristic. They integrated their shadows consciously rather than unconsciously. Consider Winston Churchill, a man who battled what he called his black dog of depression while leading Britain through its darkest hour. Rather than hiding his darkness, he channeled it into fierce determination. His speeches didn't inspire because they were optimistic. They inspired because they acknowledged the darkness while refusing to surrender to it. Churchill understood that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. Or examine Theodore Roosevelt, who transformed from a sickly, privileged boy into the embodiment of American vigor. Roosevelt didn't suppress his aggressive instincts. He directed them toward worthy challenges. He hunted dangerous game, charged up San Juan Hill, and took on corporate monopolies with equal intensity. His shadow didn't make him evil. It made him electric. Even in the realm of art, the pattern holds. Hemingway wrote with such authenticity about war, love, and death because he lived these experiences fully, embracing both creation and destruction within himself. Picasso revolutionized art, not by following rules but by breaking them, channeling his rebellious spirit into creative genius. These men understood that greatness requires the integration of seemingly contradictory forces. The contrast becomes stark when we examine those who chose suppression over integration. History is littered with capable men who remained footnotes because they couldn't embrace their full nature. The talented generals who lost wars because they couldn't access their killer instinct. The brilliant inventors who died poor because they couldn't embrace their ambition. The passionate lovers who died alone because they couldn't risk rejection. Jung studied these patterns extensively, noting that mythological heroes always faced their shadows in the form of monsters, dragons, or dark doubles. Hercules had to complete labors that required both strength and humility. Odysseus had to navigate between the monsters of rage and paralysis. These stories weren't entertainment, they were psychological blueprints for integration. The modern equivalent might be found in figures like Steve Jobs. who channeled his shadow of perfectionism and control into revolutionary products, or Muhammad Ali, who transformed his shadow of arrogance into unshakable confidence that changed sports forever. These men weren't saints. They were whole human beings who refused to apologize for their complexity. But the archetype isn't limited to famous figures. Every community has its own examples. The teacher who transforms troubled students by seeing their potential darkness as misdirected power. The entrepreneur who builds empires by embracing the risk others fear. The father who raises strong children by modeling authentic masculinity rather than sanitized virtue. The key insight is that these men didn't become visible by eliminating their darkness. They became visible by owning it. They understood that shadow integration isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming powerful in the service of something greater than themselves. Carl Jung warned that the unconscious mind, when denied healthy expression, seeks unhealthy outlets. In today's world, this principle has been weaponized against men with surgical precision. The same shadow energy that once built civilizations is now harvested by algorithms designed to keep men perpetually consuming and never creating. The invisible man doesn't just fade away naturally, he's systematically invisibilized by forces that profit from his emptiness. Consider the architecture of modern distraction. Video games that provide the illusion of heroism without real risk. Pornography that simulates intimacy without real connection. Social media that promises community while delivering isolation. Each platform is carefully calibrated to provide just enough stimulation to prevent action, but not enough satisfaction to create fulfillment. Jung understood mass psychology decades before anyone coined the term behavioral economics. He knew that when individuals lose touch with their personal myths, they become susceptible to collective myths imposed from outside. The invisible man becomes the perfect target for manipulation because he's desperate for someone to tell him who he is. The gaming industry generates more revenue than movies and music combined by offering men virtual achievements to replace real accomplishments. The protagonist saves the world, levels up, gains power, all while the player atrophies in a chair. This isn't accidental. It's engineered. Game designers study psychological addiction patterns to create what industry insiders call compulsion loops, cycles of artificial need and artificial satisfaction that bypass real human development. Similarly, the attention economy has transformed human connection into a commodity. Dating apps promise love while engineering rejection through infinite choice and gamification. Social media promises recognition while delivering comparison and inadequacy. These platforms don't just compete for attention, they compete for identity, offering ready-made personas to men who've forgotten how to create their own. The deeper horror is that these systems require invisible men to function. Visible men, men who've integrated their shadows and found their purpose, don't buy products to fill internal voids. They don't scroll endlessly because they have something to build. They don't consume content because they're busy creating it. The invisible man is the ideal customer, hungry, empty, and perpetually seeking external solutions to internal problems. Jung would recognize this as a form of psychological colonization. Just as political empires extract resources from conquered territories, digital empires extract attention and agency from conquered minds. The invisible man doesn't realize he's being harvested because the process feels like entertainment, connection, even progress. The most insidious aspect is how these systems redirect shadow energy into harmless channels. Instead of channeling competitive instincts into real achievement, men compete for meaningless rankings in virtual worlds. Instead of expressing protective aggression through real challenges, they engage in online arguments with strangers. Instead of pursuing genuine relationships that require vulnerability and growth, they consume endless streams of curated fantasy. This systematic redirection serves multiple masters. Corporations profit from engagement, governments benefit from passive populations, and social movements gain power by positioning masculinity itself as the problem. The invisible man finds himself caught in a web where every attempt to become visible is reframed as toxic, privileged, or outdated. But Jung's analysis suggests something more disturbing. These systems work because invisible men choose them. On some level, virtual heroism feels safer than real heroism. Digital validation feels less risky than an authentic relationship. Consumer identity feels easier than self-creation. The comfortable prison of distraction protects men from the terrifying responsibility of their own potential. The battlefield isn't just external, it's internal. And the war isn't just for attention or money, it's for the soul itself. The moment of awakening is always violent. One day the invisible man looks in the mirror and sees not a face but a void. He recognizes that he's been sleepwalking through his own life, consuming experiences instead of creating them, reacting to the world instead of shaping it. This recognition, Jung would say, is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you've been told to be. Jung's blueprint for visibility begins with radical acceptance of one's current invisibility. This isn't self-pity, it's strategic honesty. The invisible man must acknowledge that every choice that led to his current state was his own, even when influenced by external forces. This acceptance is crucial because victimhood, while sometimes accurate, is always powerless. A responsibility, even when painful, contains the seeds of change. The first step is shadow recognition, identifying the aspects of masculinity that have been suppressed or denied. This requires brutal self-inventory. What desires has he labeled as wrong? What ambitions has he dismissed as unrealistic? What aspects of his personality has he hidden to avoid conflict? The invisible man often discovers that he's been running from his own strength because he feared what others would think of his power. Shadow integration follows recognition. This doesn't mean unleashing every suppressed impulse. It means conscious choice about expression. The man who has denied his competitive nature might begin by setting ambitious goals and pursuing them relentlessly. The man who has suppressed his sexuality might begin by expressing authentic desire instead of performative niceness. The man who has avoided conflict might begin by stating his opinions clearly and standing behind them. The second principle is the creation of personal mythology. Jung believed that every individual needs a story that gives their life meaning beyond mere survival. The invisible man has been living someone else's story, his parents' expectations, society's demands, his peer group's values. Becoming visible requires authoring his own narrative, complete with protagonist-antagonist quest and ultimate purpose. This personal mythology must be grounded in what Jung called authentic vocation, work that expresses the individual's unique combination of talents, interests, and values. The invisible man often remains invisible because he's pursuing goals that don't actually matter to him. He seeks approval in areas where he has no genuine investment. Visibility comes not from doing what you're supposed to want, but from pursuing what you actually want with complete commitment. The third element is the cultivation of what Jung called active imagination, the ability to engage with the unconscious mind creatively rather than reactively. This might involve artistic expression, physical challenge, or spiritual practice, but the common thread is conscious dialogue with the deeper self. The invisible man must learn to distinguish between his authentic voice and the chorus of external expectations that have been drowning it out. Community selection becomes crucial at this stage. The invisible man has often surrounded himself with people who reinforce his invisibility, those who benefit from his emptiness or who share his avoidance of authentic challenge. Becoming visible requires gravitating toward those who can see and appreciate his authentic self, even when that self is still emerging. Jung's blueprint culminates in what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold creative tension between opposing forces without collapsing into either extreme. The visible man doesn't choose between light and dark, civilization and wildness, individual and collective. He integrates these opposites into a higher unity. He becomes someone who can be both gentle and fierce, both independent and connected, both confident and humble. The final requirement is unwavering commitment to the process, regardless of external validation. Jung warned that individuation often leads to temporary increased isolation, because the individuating person no longer fits into conventional categories. The man becoming visible may lose friends, face criticism, or encounter resistance from systems that benefit from his invisibility. But this is not regression. It's the natural result of authentic differentiation. The promise Jung offers is absolute. A man who completes this process becomes unignorable not through force or manipulation, but through the sheer presence of integrated authenticity. He speaks with authority because he knows himself. He acts with confidence because he trusts his judgment. He attracts respect because he respects his own nature, enough to express it fully. The choice in the end is binary and brutal. You can spend your life as a ghost, haunting the edges of your own existence, or you can risk everything to become the man you were designed to be. Jung offers no middle ground, no comfortable compromise, no gentle transition. He demands everything or nothing. Consider the mathematics of invisibility. Every day spent hiding authentic desire is a day that desire grows more desperate and distorted. Every conversation where you speak someone else's truth is a conversation where your own truth atrophies. Every moment of choosing safety over authenticity is a moment of choosing death over life. The invisible man thinks he's playing it safe, but he's actually engaging in the riskiest behavior possible, the gradual abandonment of his own soul. Jung understood that most men will choose invisibility because it feels easier. The visible man must face rejection, criticism, failure, and the constant demands of his own potential. The invisible man gets to blame external circumstances for his dissatisfaction, while avoiding the terrifying responsibility of his own power. But this choice comes with a price that compounds daily, the growing awareness that he could have been someone extraordinary. The tragedy deepens when we consider the ripple effects. The invisible man doesn't just rob himself. He robs his children of a father who models authentic masculinity, his partner of a man who brings his full self to love, his community of a contributor who might have solved important problems. His invisibility creates a void that affects everyone in his orbit, but perhaps the cruelest aspect is how invisibility becomes self-reinforcing. The longer a man remains invisible, the more evidence he accumulates that visibility is impossible. He develops what Jung called learned helplessness, the belief that his current state is permanent and unchangeable. This belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating exactly the limitations it assumes to be real. Jung's final message is simultaneously compassionate and merciless. He acknowledges that the path to visibility requires facing aspects of existence that terrify most people: the possibility of failure, the reality of death, the responsibility of power, the loneliness of authenticity. But he also insists that these challenges, when faced consciously, transform from obstacles into opportunities for transcendence. The visible man lives with constant awareness that he could lose everything he's built, but this awareness makes every moment more precious, rather than more frightening. He understands that significance comes not from avoiding risk, but from choosing which risks are worthy of his life force. He knows that death is certain, but meaninglessness is optional. Jung's ruthless advice ultimately points toward a stunning revelation. The invisible man is not invisible because he lacks power. He's invisible because he refuses to use the power he has. Every moment of continued invisibility is not a result of external oppression, but of internal abdication. This recognition is devastating because it eliminates every excuse, but it's also liberating because it reveals that change is always possible. The choice stands before every man reading these words. You can close this exploration and return to the comfortable numbness of invisibility, treating these insights as interesting ideas rather than urgent invitations. Or you can recognize this moment as the beginning of your own individuation, your own integration, your own emergence from the shadows into the light of authentic presence. Jung's final promise is both a benediction and a warning. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The man who accepts this privilege becomes unforgettable. The man who rejects it remains invisible until death erases even the possibility of visibility forever. The question that haunts every invisible man is not whether he can become visible. The question is whether he dares to stop choosing invisibility. Because in Jung's ruthless psychology, every day spent hiding is a day stolen from the person you might have become. Time is running out. The choice is yours. But choose quickly. Invisibility has a way of making the choosing impossible.